I started driving for Uber in my free time to make some extra cash. The job was usually straightforward. Pick people up, drop them off, and occasionally hear some interesting stories along the way. But one ride taught me that even the most mundane routine can take a terrifying turn. It was late on a Friday night, and the city was bustling with people heading to and from bars and clubs. I got a ride request from a woman named Sophie, who needed a pickup from a quiet residential area about 15 minutes away. The area wasn't far, but it was known for being a bit isolated, with winding streets and sparse lighting. When I arrived at the pickup point, Sophie was already waiting at the curb. She looked normal enough, mid-30s, casually dressed, holding a small handbag. She smiled and greeted me politely, which put me at ease right away. Her destination was about 40 minutes out, to a small suburban town I didn't know well. As we drove, Sophie struck up a conversation. She mentioned that she had been visiting a friend and was heading home after a long week at work. She seemed friendly, the kind of passenger that made the job enjoyable. We chatted for a while about mundane topics, traffic, the weather, and her plans for the weekend. About halfway through the ride, she asked if I could take a slight detour. She said she needed to stop quickly to pick something up from another friend who lived nearby. I hesitated, since Uber's policy discourages unplanned stops, but she assured me it was just a couple of minutes off the main route. I reluctantly agreed and adjusted the navigation to follow her directions. The detour led us to a less traveled road surrounded by woods. Streetlights became sparse, and the houses were spaced farther apart. Sophie's demeanor shifted slightly. She became quieter, no longer making small talk. I chalked it up to the late hour, but my unease started to grow as the road became darker and more isolated. Finally, she told me to pull into the driveway of a small, nondescript house. There were no lights on inside, and the property looked abandoned. The driveway was cracked, and weeds had grown through the concrete. Sophie assured me this was the right place and asked me to wait while she ran inside. She got out of the car and walked toward the house, disappearing into the shadows near the front door. Minutes passed, and there was no sign of her returning. I started to feel uneasy. I considered calling out to her, but something about the silence made me hesitate. Then I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was Sophie coming back, but the figure was different, taller, broader, and moving slowly. My heart began to race as the figure approached the car from behind. I couldn't make out their face, but their deliberate pace and the way they stayed just out of the reach of my taillights made my stomach churn. I locked the doors immediately and kept my eyes on the mirror. The figure stopped just a few feet behind the car and stood there, motionless. I was about to roll down the window and yell for Sophie when I saw another movement, this time from the house. Two more figures emerged from the darkness near the front door, heading toward the car. Neither of them looked like Sophie. Panic surged through me. I honked the horn, hoping it would either scare them off or alert Sophie, but neither happened. Instead, the first figure moved closer, now standing right by the trunk of the car. My instincts screamed at me to drive away, but Sophie's bag was still in the back seat. What if she was in trouble? What if she was part of whatever was happening? I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I threw the car into reverse, forcing the figure behind me to jump out of the way, then shifted into drive and sped out of the driveway. As I turned onto the main road, I looked back to see the figures standing there, motionless, watching me leave. I drove a few blocks before pulling over to call the police. I explained what had happened and gave them the address of the house. I also tried calling Sophie through the Uber app, but her phone went straight to voicemail. The police contacted me later that night. They had gone to the house but found no one there. They did, however, find signs that someone had been living in the house recently. Food wrappers, a sleeping bag, and several backpacks. I reported the incident to Uber, but Sophie's account was deactivated shortly afterward, making it impossible for me to get any more information. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they were planning. All I know is that I was lucky to get out of there when I did. I used to drive for Uber on the night shift. The city never sleeps, and neither did I, shuttling people from bars, clubs, and late-night shifts. I had plenty of strange encounters, but one night stood out, something that left me unable to return to driving altogether. It was a quiet Tuesday, the kind of night where requests trickled in every 30 minutes or so. Around 2 a.m., I got a ping for a pickup in a residential area outside the city. The location was on a dead-end street, where old houses stood separated by large patches of unlit woods. I debated canceling. Rides from isolated areas always felt risky, but the fare was good, and I didn't want my cancellation rate to spike. When I arrived, the street was eerily silent. Most of the houses were dark, their occupants long asleep. The pin on the app was at the end of the road, next to a house with a single porch light on. I waited for a few minutes, looking around for any sign of movement, but no one appeared. I tapped the app's "I've arrived" button and waited. Just as I was about to cancel, a man emerged from the shadows near the house. He wasn't coming from the front door, but rather from the side yard, where the woods began. He walked slowly toward the car, and something about him made me uneasy. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up, obscuring most of his face. He got into the back seat without saying a word. I asked if he was the passenger who had requested the ride, and he nodded, still silent. His destination was already loaded into the app, a spot about 20 miles away, on the other side of the city. I decided to keep my questions to myself and started driving. The tension in the car was palpable. He didn't say a single word, not even when I made small talk to break the silence. Most passengers at least grunted in response, but this man remained completely mute. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror occasionally, and each time, I felt a shiver run down my spine. He wasn't looking out the window or at his phone. He was staring straight ahead, his hood casting deep shadows over his face. About 10 minutes into the ride, I noticed something odd. The app's navigation showed a straight route, but the man had entered a detour, directing me onto smaller, darker roads. I hesitated, wondering if I should follow the route. When I asked him about the change, he finally spoke, his voice low and flat. He said it was a shortcut and told me to just follow the directions. His tone wasn't aggressive, but there was something commanding about it. Against my better judgment, I followed the new route. The road grew narrower, and soon, we were driving through an area with no streetlights. Trees lined both sides of the road, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. My unease grew with every passing minute. Then, he did something that made my blood run cold. He leaned forward slightly and asked me to turn off the app's navigation. He said he knew the way from here and didn't want the noise from the phone. His voice was calm, almost monotone, but the request felt like a threat. My instincts screamed at me to refuse, but I didn't want to provoke him. I turned off the navigation but kept my phone in my lap, ready to hit the emergency button if needed. He directed me to turn left onto a dirt road that I hadn't even noticed until he pointed it out. The car bumped along the uneven path, the headlights barely illuminating the dense forest around us. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a clearing. He told me to stop the car and wait. I froze, my heart pounding. The clearing was empty, surrounded by nothing but trees. There were no houses, no landmarks, nothing that explained why we were there. I tried to keep my voice steady as I asked if this was his destination. He didn't answer. Instead, he opened the door and got out, motioning for me to stay in the car. He walked toward the edge of the clearing and disappeared into the trees. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Every instinct told me to drive away, but fear rooted me to the spot. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Then I saw movement in the trees. He emerged, walking back toward the car with something in his hand. It looked like a duffel bag, though I couldn't be sure in the dim light. He got back into the car without a word and told me to drive back to the city. The ride back was the longest of my life. He gave me new directions, leading us to a different part of town than his original destination. When we finally reached a rundown apartment complex, he got out and tossed a crumpled bill onto the front seat. He didn't say thank you, didn't look back, just disappeared into the shadows. I checked the bill. It was a $100 note, far more than the ride's fare. I reported the incident to Uber the next day, but they couldn't do much without more details. I tried to put the experience behind me, but I couldn't stop wondering what he was doing in those woods, and what was in that bag. I remember that night vividly, even though it happened months ago. It was one of those rides that stay with you, not because it was memorable in a good way, but because it left a permanent knot of unease in your chest. I had been driving Uber for a couple of years, mostly during evening hours. I preferred the night shift for the higher fares and fewer traffic jams, but the clientele was always a gamble. You'd get everything from chatty partygoers to quiet commuters who didn't even look up from their phones. But this ride was different, off in a way I still can't quite put into words. It was around 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, a time when things had usually started to wind down. I got a ping for a pickup at a gas station on the outskirts of town. These types of rides weren't uncommon. People often hailed Ubers from convenience stores or gas stations when they were stranded. When I arrived, I didn't see anyone at first. The gas station was mostly empty, its harsh fluorescent lights flickering faintly. The clerk inside barely glanced up from his magazine. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, the passenger appeared from around the corner of the building. He was tall and thin, wearing a plain black coat and jeans. His face was pale, and his eyes seemed to linger too long on everything they looked at, as if he were cataloging his surroundings. He walked to the car with measured steps, got into the back seat, and quietly said, "Drive." I asked him for a destination, but he just said, "I'll tell you where to go." This wasn't completely unusual. Some passengers preferred to give directions verbally rather than inputting a location into the app. Still, there was something about his tone that made me uneasy. It wasn't demanding, but it carried an unsettling weight, like he wasn't used to hearing the word no. I started driving slowly, waiting for him to give me instructions. He finally told me to take a right turn onto a long, desolate road that ran parallel to the highway. The road wasn't well lit, and the further we went, the fewer houses I saw. The occasional street lamp cast shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark. He didn't speak much, only giving brief, curt instructions like, "Turn here or go straight." I tried to make small talk to ease the tension, asking if he was heading home or visiting someone. He didn't answer. Instead, he just sat there, staring out the window, his hands resting on his lap. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was leading me somewhere specific, though I couldn't imagine where. The route he chose seemed random, winding through back roads that even I, a local, had rarely driven. After about 20 minutes, he told me to pull over. We were in the middle of nowhere, a stretch of road flanked by empty fields and dense trees. There wasn't a single house or car in sight. I stopped the car and turned to face him, trying to mask the unease in my voice as I asked if this was his destination. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket. My heart raced as I braced myself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. But all he pulled out was a crumpled piece of paper. He handed it to me without a word. The note was scribbled with an address I didn't recognize, and underneath it were the words, "Take me here." I punched the address into my phone's GPS, and it led to a location about 15 miles away, in the opposite direction from where we'd been heading. I asked why we hadn't gone there in the first place, but he didn't answer. He just nodded toward the road, indicating I should keep driving. The closer we got to the address, the stranger I felt. It was a dilapidated part of town, where most buildings were either abandoned or barely habitable. The address led to an old warehouse at the end of a dead-end street. There were no lights, no signs of activity, just the dark, looming structure and the faint hum of the nearby highway. I pulled up to the warehouse and stopped. The man didn't move at first. He just sat there, staring out the window at the building. After what felt like an eternity, he finally opened the door and stepped out. Before he closed the door, he leaned back in and said, "Wait here." Everything in me screamed to leave, but curiosity, or maybe fear, kept me rooted in place. He walked toward the warehouse, disappearing into the shadows. I waited for a few minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. My mind raced with possibilities. What was he doing in there? Was someone waiting for him? Eventually, I saw him reappear, carrying a small, square package. He got back into the car and handed me a $100 bill, telling me to take him back to where I'd picked him up. The ride back was silent. He didn't offer an explanation for the detour, and I didn't ask. By the time we reached the gas station, I was exhausted from the tension. He stepped out without a word, disappearing around the corner where I'd first seen him. I reported the ride to Uber as suspicious, but there was little they could do without concrete evidence of wrongdoing. To this day, I wonder what was in that package, and why he chose me for that strange, unsettling journey.